Well, I'd like to welcome Tim G4VXE along tonight to talk about simple satellite operating. And as some of you know, this is something I've tried over the last sort of few weeks, and it's been a rocky road, I think. If you look on the internet and try and find information as to what frequencies to use, what tone codes to use, what satellites are going overhead and so on, there's a lot of out-of-date misinformation and missing information there. And hopefully Tim, with his talk tonight, will tell us how to do it simply.
Well, I'll do my best.
And I think, Tim, you mentioned there maybe a couple going overhead that we may be able to listen to.
We'll see what we can do. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. It's nice to be here. It's nice to have a good evening as well. I am hopeful we'll be able to hear some satellites. I think about 50 Esso goes over, which is a voice satellite, is FM, and very shortly after that the ISS will be going over. I don't think we'll hear any voice from the ISS. I don't think anyone's operating voice at the moment, but we might be able to hear some packets, so we'll see how it goes. And if it starts to pour with rain, all bets are off, because I'm not going out there. So, yeah, it's all about simple satellite operating tonight. When people used to talk to me about satellite operating, I always used to have visions of automated antennas with azimuth and elevation, which cost loads of money and very expensive rigs and so on. Well, I am here to show you that there's another way. It's not to say that the other way isn't exciting and lots of fun and great to put together, but this is the automated satellite tracking system that I use, just following it across the sky like that. And the very cheapest of my satellite operating rigs, the good old Baofeng UV5 for 30 quid. And I've probably made, I don't know, 150 QSOs with that thing on the satellite. So it doesn't have to cost a fortune. Anyway, when did I get... Jonathan was asking me how long I'd been playing satellites. Well, going back to when I was very first licensed, which is not as long ago as some here, but is, I think, 1983. Very quickly after I got licensed as a Class B licensee, I was interested in the Mode A satellites, which is 2 meters up and 10 meters down. And it was a great way of working DX without, of working across the pond without having a Class A license at the time. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. Did that for a few months, and then of course I got my Class A license, got distracted with HF and all the other stuff, and forgot about it for many years. So it was about 3 or 4 years ago when I saw on Twitter some tweets from Pete, 2E0SQL, who at the time was in Oxford, and he was showing lots of pictures of him working all sorts of interesting DX, using an antenna rather like this and an FT817, and I thought, that looks fun. I wonder if I could do that. And Pete said, of course you can, like any good, encouraging person. Let's not go the wrong way. I think I'd know how to do that by now. So my very first experiment was with the good old Baofeng UV5R, but with its rubber duck antenna. Sorry, I'm giving you a horrible time with the camera. So yes, with a very simple rubber duck antenna, I looked up the details on the internet of where SO50 is with frequencies, and we'll cover some of that. And I thought, well, let's see if I can just hear it. And sure enough, with the rubber duck antenna, with the squelch off, I might add, I did manage to just hear something as the satellite went over. So I thought, well, that was that was encouraging. But it obviously wasn't going to be enough to make some contacts, and so I needed to do something better. And I thought a better aerial was definitely the place to start. Let's talk a little bit about the Xw2 Satellite. It's quite old now. It was launched in 2002. There are older satellites around that we're using in regular operation, and we'll come to that. Frequency-wise, it's quite a nice one to start with. It's got a 2-metre uplink, 145/850. And a 70 SEMS downlink. The reason that it's quite nice to start off with, one of the things that you may or you may not have thought about with satellite operating is Doppler shift. Now, hopefully you're probably all familiar with Doppler shift with an ambulance, and you hear the siren come up and as it passes you. Well, think about the satellite and the radio waves. Realise that the satellite is moving at about 17,000 miles an hour, fairly quick, and that has as the satellite's coming towards you, that means that the frequency that you're receiving is higher than what you would expect, and that effect is increased the higher you go in frequency. So, why am I telling you all this? Well, it's kind of fun to know that the satellite's going at 17,500 miles an hour, which is really quite quick. But the great thing with a 2-metre uplink, you don't actually have to fiddle with the frequency very much throughout the pass. It stays within a kc or two of that centre frequency. So as a beginner, you can leave your transmit on 145/850. And you're all set. You will have to follow the downlink, and hopefully in a few minutes we'll give you a bit of a demo of that. But the satellite generally appears in frequency about 436, 800, 805, and then I just follow it down, and probably about 790 as it goes directly overhead, and as it vanishes over the horizon, probably you'll lose it about 436, 780. So you do have to do some tracking, but that's really easy, and we'll talk about how to do that. CTCSS tone, yes, absolutely. On Xw2 it's a 67 hertz tone, so it really is just like accessing your repeater. If you haven't got the CTCSS tone on, you won't get through the repeater. Xw2's got a feature which, if it hasn't heard a signal for about 10 minutes, it'll actually turn the transmitter off to save the batteries and the solar power. It's not usually a problem here. It usually will have heard something going over the US, and that's not very far away in time terms when you're travelling that fast. But if you think, well, the satellite should be there and I'm not hearing anything, if you send a 74.4 hertz CTCSS tone, that should wake it up. The satellite orbits about every 100 minutes, there or thereabouts. So, having decided that the rubber duck was not quite the way to go, I thought, well, what options have I got? Lots of options, of course, but I decided to use an ELK log periodic antenna, which is available from the AMSAT UK shop. Now, a number of you are going to look at that and say, it's not a log periodic antenna, Tim, it can't possibly work. You might have a point. I don't actually know how this antenna works, but it does. And people often ask me at talks, so this is kind of like my caveat, and say, please don't ask me about the antenna. So please don't ask me about that. But there is some stuff on the net which is which sort of gives some ideas about how these work. But normally you expect much more of a taper with a log periodic. But it does work very well on 2 meters and 70 SEMS. Yeah, we published a picture of one of these in Practical Wireless one day saying it was a log periodic antenna, and a couple of people wrote to me saying, it's not a log periodic antenna. Okay, yes. So, yes, I am a bit sensitive about that one. But yeah, the antenna works really well. You can also get some Arrow antennas from the AMSAT UK shop, which I think they're cross-polarized. You've got one set of elements for 2 meters and one for 70. Have you got one, Tony?
No, but I've used one.
Yeah. And those look really good. I always have the nagging, you know how the grass is always slightly greener on the other side of the fence. I always have this nagging feeling that the Arrow antenna is slightly better than my elk, but I think they both work pretty well. So those are the commercial options. They're reasonably expensive. I think this is now probably about £125. The Arrow is probably similar. So yeah, quite expensive. But there are lots of other options that you can do if you want to play around. A good friend of mine in Gibraltar, he made I think it was a 2 meter antenna out of 2 rabbit ears antennas for TV from the pound store, and that seemed to work quite well, and had another. Oh yeah, the 70 SEMS Yagi he had was an old television antenna, so you can do lots of playing around with that. You can use. You might have seen tape measure Yagis where you use the metal tape measures to make the elements, and those work quite well as well. So really cheap. And I had a lovely email one day from a guy in Lithuania who I'd worked on Esso50, and he was using. I don't know if you remember, this is the UV5, which is the big brother, but there was the little UV3R, which is tiny. And this guy had worked me on a homebrew antenna that he'd made in a UV3, and he was really pleased, and I thought that was a really nice QSO. I suppose the only thing I would say is please don't try and use your collinear on Esso50. Why is that? Well, what you will find is that Esso50 has got really good ears, but it's quite low powered. So it will probably be hearing you when you're not hearing it. And with the pattern of a collinear, you're not going to get a lot of signal on as it goes overhead. So I'm always a bit nervous about doing demonstrations involving Esso50 in the evening and at weekends. And the reason for that is that what you tend to find is that Esso50 can be a bit of a zoo. So as it comes over Europe, you'll get people saying, "Hola, hola," and of course they can't hear themselves coming back, but we can all hear them. So we may get a demo of that in a few minutes. I'm not sure. And I think what's happening is that they're using a simple antenna like a collinear and thinking, oh, maybe I'll be able to hear it, but actually they can't. So there are some satellites which we'll talk about later, which you probably will hear on your collinear, but please don't try and use it for Esso50. So I've talked a little bit about the frequency. It normally appears at about 800, 805. Pretty easy to track by hand and follow across the sky. That we've got various programs that we'll talk about which help you track where the satellite's going to be at any particular time. Do try and find somewhere with a nice low horizon. It makes such a difference. All the satellite operating that I did to start with was from my back garden, and of course we've got trees and houses and so on all around, and it works absolutely fine. But I'll talk about the QSOs a bit later. But I wanted to work some people at a greater distance, so I thought, well, I'll just go to the edge of the village where it's a much lower horizon. Bit like your balcony, actually. And and see what I could hear. And it was just such a different world. You know, I could, particularly as the satellite went down over towards the east, I could hear a UA4, a UA9. And if my Russian was better, I could have probably worked to UA0 as well, which is you know, a really long way across Russia. I haven't talked about full duplex or semi-duplex. So full duplex means that you are able to listen at the same time as you're transmitting. So that's really helpful. It gives you an idea of whether you're getting through the satellite okay or whether somebody else is coming through, and gives you an idea if you should stop transmitting and not cause any interference. That's the ideal. You can't operate full duplex with one of these. If you're transmitting, the receiver shuts off. So I think, you know, for beginning experiments and so on, semi-duplex is absolutely fine, but it is good practice if you can operate full duplex. There's various ways you can do that. The Kenwood THD72, which I've got over there, which I use for APRS, you can actually transmit and receive. You can transmit on 2 meters and listen on 70 SEMS at the same time. There's not too many rigs that you can do that with. What I have found is that if any of you have got mobile rigs like the FT8800 or the 8900, yeah, those work really well. You can set one side up on 70 SEMS, transmit on 2 meters, stick a headphone in, and it works really well. And you know, don't run 50 watts at the satellite, but you know, 10 watts or something like that should work really well. Keep looking at my watch to see how we're doing. So if you have got a Baofeng and you fancy using that as a good cheap way to start, you know, it's 30 quid, why not? What I found was really useful was to program up various memories in the rig, so that all I have to do during the lifetime of a pass is just follow it down by clicking through the memories. So as you'll remember, I can leave the transmit frequency at 145.850 with my CTCSS on, so I can do that across my 5 memories. But I'll start the first memory I'll use. We'll have the receiver on 436.805. The next channel that I'll go to will have the receiver on 436.800, and just go down in 5 kc steps. And that's really easy. And I discovered that if I used the Baofeng programming software, which is interesting to you. Have any of you used the Baofeng? Tried it. I can understand that. I mean, well, we'll come to that, Tony. One of the first challenges is that the Baofeng software comes up in Chinese. So actually the menu item is the second one in from the right and the second menu item down, and then it'll go into English. So that was my first major discovery. The reason actually, Chirp is a super bit of software, and actually normally I would really recommend that you program these with Chirp. But actually the reason it's great to use the Baofeng software for satellite operation is that it doesn't mind if you have the transmit and receive frequencies on different bands, whereas Chirp doesn't like that, which is, I ought to write to them and say, could you just make a small change? Because they probably don't know. So yeah, if you can get your head around the Chinese menus and getting it into English, you'll be fine. So yeah, just program a series of memories so that you can follow the satellite as it comes over. And the only other thing that I always get reports if I'm using one of these that my audio isn't very loud or something like that, and I'm sure. Lots of you may well have modified your UV5s in a technical way so that the audio is a bit stronger and a bit better. I've heard of people actually drilling out the hole of the microphone to try and get a bit more oomph of it. I used the Baofeng for a while, and it seemed to be okay. And then I worked a guy one day. I was like, I can hardly hear you, old man. I thought, okay, maybe it's not great. So I thought, well, I wonder if a headset might be quite useful. And it was around about the time that Heil, who many of you will be familiar with, makes some very nice headsets for HF. They actually came up with some headsets for handhelds. I suppose what sort of slightly stuck in my throat, that I was paying 30 quid for the handheld and 35 quid for the headset. But actually it does work really well, and the audio is much nicer quality. And actually sometimes, particularly late at night, it's quite nice if you're operating from the garden or something to have a headset on. Somebody told me the other day that there is a cheap headset in the CPC catalogue, which works really well for these. I think, in fact, they're about less than 20 quid, I think. So you know, bringing the expense down a little bit, and you can get them for Baofengs or the headphone connector for many of the different handheld types. So might be worth a look there. Can't remember the name, but if anyone's interested, email me and I'll find the details. Okay, so. One of the nice things about writing for Practical Wireless is that, you know, various people write into you and you know, tell you what they're doing. And Kev, who's actually M0GTD here from the southeast, he spends a lot of time in Gibraltar as ZB2GI, and I was really excited when he started getting interested in satellites, and I thought, oh, good, I'll drop him an email, see if we can have a QSO. So sure enough, we started off, and Kev was using Kev was using two of these. He was using two separate antennas, so he was doing really well with the whole juggling thing when he started off. And anyway, we had a few goes at working, and we heard each other pretty quickly, but we didn't manage to complete a QSO. And then there was one evening, and he said, "Oh, can you be on this particular pass?" I think it was about 6:30 in the evening, and it was one of the days when I'd been working in London, and I said to him, "Well, if the train's on time, we stand a chance." So I stuck all this stuff in the back of the car, and it was about 6:15, and the train was just coming into Didcot, and I thought, well, stand a chance, and across the footbridge. And it was only about then that I suddenly realised that I was going to feel a bit self-conscious standing in the edge of Didcot car park. ZB2GI. I'd love to say to you that, having done all that I worked him, but of course I didn't. But I did work him eventually, and this is one of the joys of the low horizon. I live just up the A420 towards Oxford, in a little village called Longworth, and you can just see the Ridgeway in the background there. So I went out to the edge of the village where the horizon is a little bit lower, and we did manage to make a QSO as the satellite just came up over the Ridgeway, and before there was too much activity on the satellite. So that's another way of operating. That's Patrick WD9EWK, who lives in Phoenix in Arizona, and he uses his wheelie bin for his operating platform. As you can see, it's night time. The reason for that, I'm sure many of you realise, Phoenix is quite a hot place to live, and during the summer, I don't think Patrick likes going out in the midday sun, so he actually enjoys operating satellites at night. And you can see he's got an FT817 and so on there. So yeah, he's worked lots of stations from his wheelie bin. Satellite predictions. So how do you know when the satellite's going to come over? Oop. Hopefully. Still got some audio?
Probably fall out. Do you want to tuck it back on your...
Yeah.
Give it a good push down.
There we go. Let's try that. Okay. Yeah, so how do you know when the satellite's going to come over? Lots of software. Gpredict is a really nice one. It runs under Windows, or you can run it on a Raspberry Pi on Linux, or any Linux variant actually. In fact, it was quite nice running it on the Raspberry Pi. I just had the Raspberry Pi running on a nice big monitor in the shack, and it would just tell me whenever one of the satellites was over. There's a lovely bit of software called SatPC32 for Windows, and that's just amazing. It will do things like control your rig and compensate for the Doppler shift on both transmit and receive at any point during the pass. So you can just tune up and down the band on your computer-controlled rig, and it'll just work out where you're transmitting and receiving. It's absolutely amazing. So that's a really nice piece of software. If you register it, I think it does cost a bit, but you can actually use it in unregistered mode. And I think the worst that happens is that you have to put in your latitude and longitude each time you load up the software, which is it's not the end of the world. But I would encourage you to look at that software, and it's the other thing that's very nice about it. If you're trying to have a sked with somebody who's quite a long way away, you can work out when the satellite is going to be visible to both of you, and what frequency you should transmit and receive on, and what and what frequency.
Remind you of the time.
Thank you.
Mine says it's coming over right now. So
what I'm working on the basis of, I'm trying to be, because we haven't got a very good horizon to the southwest, I'm going to chance my arm and say we won't listen until about halfway through the pass, when hopefully it's about overhead. Do you think I'm being a bit optimistic?
No, but you've still got time. You still need to be aware of the time.
Yeah, thank you. There are programs, which is a lovely segue. There are programs that you can run on your phone. What free are you?
This is GoSat.
GoSat Watch. That's the one I use for iOS. That works very nicely. SatX Pro, there's any number of them. If you're an Android person, AMSat Droid works quite nicely. So what we might do, you've got me worried now. So let's just have a quick 2028. Oh yes, I think we're good for a little while. Sorry, let's just, it'll be here somewhere. Okay, so that probably rather hard for you to see, but there's a picture of the sky, and it's sort of coming up from the southwest. Pretty much goes straight overhead. And then will vanish off to the northeast, which I'm hoping we're going to have a reasonably good view of as it goes out across the ridgeway. So that should be good. So yeah, lots of options for working out where a satellite is. You need to download the orbital elements every once in a little while as the satellites change. As they sort of gradually fall. Right, I think we should have what we'll do. I'll tell you what, Andy.
Oh, something already.
Let's have a...
Fox 1 Golf Hotel X3, F1 GA6, Fox 1 Golf Hotel X3.
Golf 4 Victor X-ray Echo.
Right.
Golf 4 Victor X-ray Echo.
Fox Hotel X3, F1 GA6, Fox 1 Golf Hotel X3.
F1 GXX Golf 4 Victor X-ray Echo.
Ontario, Mexico 0, Mike Sierra.
Golf 4 Victor X-ray Echo. UR3 CTB G4VXE 5 and 9 IO91. Golf 4 Victor X-ray Echo. So what you won't have seen is I've tweaked the frequency down a couple of times. It's overhead, so a lot of people have probably lost it about now, but we should. And the other trick is to rotate the antenna. I think it's probably gone behind the trees. But anyway, gives you an idea. Sorry we didn't work anyone, but it's... That's that.
Like any pilot, though, everybody just shouts.
It is. It is. I would say that the late evening passes, and if you're lucky enough to be around during the weekday, then daytime passes can be a little bit better. So what I'm going to
just thinking about summer activities and stuff. Would you suggest that, for example, Barbary would be the sort of, you know, place maybe you're out of towns and
that would work really well. Yeah.
Yeah, true, but
you know, anywhere with a low horizon will work very, very well. So yeah, I think you just try it. You know, yeah. I'm sure it'll be good. Right.
Hackpad would be better.
Okay, so ISS will be over at 2039 on the western horizon. It'll set about 2050, so that's 11. So about 5 minutes through. So about quarter to 9, we'll have a listen for the ISS and see what we can do. Right. So there are other FM satellites that it's well worth having a listen for. AO85, I was talking to Jonathan about this. It's a very, very strong signal on 145980. It's so strong that you'll hear it on a handheld with a rubber duck. It really is that strong. You'll struggle to work through it because you need a bit more oomph on 77s. But if you just want to listen, then 145980 is a really good place to listen. Some of the documentation about AO85 is a bit misleading. I think it talks about an uplink frequency of 435,180. In reality, the uplink is about 10 kcs lower, 435,170, as the centre of the pass band. So that's worth bearing in mind if you program up the rig. LilacSat, one of the Chinese launches, it's a very good satellite. It works very well. Unfortunately, the guys in China weren't terribly well briefed about band planning and so on. So the uplink is actually on 144,350.
And died, wasn't that? What's wrong with it?
Absolutely. Probably heard all throughout you. Well, actually, in practice, it doesn't get activated too often. It doesn't get activated too often. It was actually built by some of the students at one of the Chinese technical universities, and of course, those guys moved on, and there was nobody to operate the control station anymore. But what I did want to suggest to you is, if you want to see if a particular satellite is operating, do check the AMSAT operating status page, which, if I'd had a brain, I would have actually put on the slide, but it's amsat.org/status. What I will do is I'll amend that and send the slides to Jonathan, so that if anyone's interested, you can have it as a PDF, and all the information will be there. But yeah, that status page tells you what satellites are on and what mode is in operation. AO85, so it is a little bit harder to operate, this one. It's 2 meters down and 70 sems up, and as we talked about the Doppler shift, that means that you have to compensate for the varying uplink by just changing channel a lot more often. So it does take a bit more doing. Actually, I also found that although you can have a QSO with a 5-watt handheld on AO85, it pretty much needs to be overhead and all ducks in a row. But if you want to have a bit more success with AO85, a mobile like the FT8900, the 8800, the F350, those will work really well. Again, you don't need to run 50 watts, honestly. 10 watts will be fine. But that does work really well. And the other thing that you need to know about AO85 is that it's got cross-polarized antennas for the different bands. So exactly, Tony, what you need to do, you'll peak it up on receive, and then as you transmit, you flick it around through 90 degrees.
Do you not find that polarisation changes anyway?
It does.
One time we did it in Swindon, we had 2 separate antennas, and we were forever able to do that with the antennas.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it's quite interesting. At one point in the pass, you'll find it's polarised a particular way, and by the time it's gone through.
These were much lower passes, so
yeah.
affected it more.
Yes, on low passes that can be quite interesting. AO85 sounds a bit noisy at times. There's a sort of swishing noise, and I think that's they use some subsonic audio for telemetry. It's not quite as subsonic as they might have hoped, I think it's fair to say. So it does sound a bit noisy at times, but once a good strong signal is coming through it, it sounds quite good. If you want to decode the telemetry, there's some Java-based software which you can run, and it seems to work quite well. But yeah, AO85 does take a bit more getting used to, and I'd say I've only just recently got comfortable with operating. But the nice thing about it compared to SO50, you just had a nice demonstration of how busy SO50 is. AO85 is a bit more relaxed and a bit more chilled, so there's a bit more time to make QSOs. Right, the International Space Station. Almost think I timed this, I haven't. So there's occasional voice activity on 145800, which I'm sure many of you have heard. When Tim Peake was up, he was quite active. There have been it's quite nice actually. Some of the astronauts really seem to enjoy the amateur radio stuff. There was an Italian guy, Luca, I can't remember his second name, but he loved it. It wasn't something that he'd done before, but he felt it very much kept him in touch with what was happening on the ground and talking to different people. So he would actually come up on Twitter and say, I'm coming across the Atlantic, I'm about to call CQ on 145800. So bomb up to the shack, and of course you wouldn't work him, but it was quite interesting to hear. So yeah, there's not a huge amount of voice activity on, although the school's contacts and so on are quite well publicised, and you can see those. But what is on most of the time is packet radio on 145825, and what we'll do is we'll just stick this on, and we've got about 3 minutes to go, so it's all fine. Actually, I think towards the end of last year, they had a problem with their 2-metre rig, and the packet had to go on to 70 SEMS for a while, and that was quite interesting to cope with the Doppler shift and so on. But so what you can, I'm not sure how many of you have played with packet radio. I'm sure many of you have, but it's an APRS digipeater, so you can just send simple text messages to people. You can send beacons and so on. There's sort of the odd beacon is fine, but it's actually quite fun to try and swap messages with people as it goes over. So we'll see what we pick up in a moment, but there should be something. If you've got one of those rigs or some of the Yaesu fusion rigs, you probably on a decent overhead pass, you'll get a signal through with the standard rubber duck antenna if you're lucky, if it's reasonably quiet. Being this further west seems to help. I've occasionally tried to do it from London at lunchtime, and it's noticeably harder, I think, because the satellite is starting to see much more of mainland Europe at that stage, so you're competing with a few more signals. But if any of you have got some of these extended rubber duck, well, not rubber ducks, but telescopic antennas, those work really well. And of course, something like this will work quite well as well. What do you need to do? You need to set the unproto path to include one of the ISS digipeater's aliases, so either ARIS or RS0ISS, and then you're all set. If you haven't got one of these handhelds, then you could try, if you've got a TNC, that should work fine, connected up to your radio, and you can even use a collinear for something like this. If you've got a 2-metre beam up, it seems to be that the ISS antenna is pretty much horizontally polarised, at least at the horizon. Stick it on the beam, and you should hear some whopping great signals. If you fancy trying to decode it and you haven't got a TNC or one of these handhelds, there's some nice software from UZ7HO which will decode the tones using a sound card. Just feed the audio in, just like any other digimode, and it'll pop the text up on the screen. And there's a a program called UISS, which allows you to type messages and so on. So that's quite a nice way to start, just with your home station. Pick some high passes and have a listen and see what you can do. Right. Shall we have a listen and see if there's... It's not actually going to be a terribly exciting demo, because you're going to hear, all being well, a sort of brap of packet, and I'm going to say to you, oh, that was so-and-so. So that's not really that exciting, but the other thing I need to know is kind of where the satellite is. So I shall look at my track. Due south, thank you very much. Right, let's go and I shall switch this squelch. Oh, there we go, RS0ISS. There we go. We got our signal through it, so we're all done. There we go. G4VXE down in Exeter. That's the beacon of the space station. P1NTN. HB3YGP. The furthest I've heard, if heard is the right thing, is TA1BM in Istanbul. IZ5TP. Anyway, that was a bit more successful than SO50. I don't know if anybody has got a phone which is connected to the internet, but if you go to ariss.net, you should see G4VXE plotted on the map somewhere around here, and also a list of the packets that have come through the space station and been gated back to ground. So just before I finish this slide, the very simplest receive only, which I was actually quite proud of, because when I started getting interested in the ISS and decoding the APRS, was typically high tech for me. I got a handheld. I think it was probably our old friend. Opened the squelch and found a program that I could run on my smartphone, which would decode the packet. And obviously there were no leads involved, because that would involve effort, and just hold the output, or crank the volume up a little bit, and have the microphone of the phone decoding the packets, and it worked absolutely fine. Obviously, it doesn't work terribly well for transmit, but you'll decode some stuff that way. So that's quite fun. This is the map I was talking about. Obviously, this isn't live in true Blue Peter style. This is one I recorded earlier, but it gives you an idea of the different stations around the world. As I was saying to you, I think the furthest station that I've heard is TA1BM in Istanbul. Yeah, it's quite it's probably the easiest satellite operating that you can do, but it's strangely compulsive actually, and it's quite, if I see that the ISS is coming over in an evening, I'll quite often just go out in the garden and see if I can bounce a signal through. Maybe if I can be bothered to put the aerial together, then perhaps I'll use that, or maybe I'll use just a rubber duck and see what happens. And there's all sorts of, it's quite fun doing it from portable setups. This is Andrew. For the life of me, I can't remember his call sign now, but he's a caravanner, and he popped a mag mount on a biscuit tin lid on the caravan roof and bounced his signal through the ISS, which is a pretty cool thing to tell your fellow campers about, isn't it, really? Sometimes you get people announcing satellite de-expedition information through the ISS with messages and so on. So, yeah, good fun. FO29. So all the satellites that we've talked about so far have been FM satellites. FO29 is a linear transponder, which means that it takes, I think it's about 50 kc's worth of bandwidth of narrowband modes like sideband or Morse, and essentially repeats them onto the other band. So FO29, its uplink is centred on 145950, so a corresponding signal will come out on 435850. What you do need to know is that if you're operating on, it does inverting, so if you want to come out on upper sideband, as you do want to come out on upper sideband, you need to transmit on lower sideband on 2 meters. CW operators, it's not a problem. So this FO29 has a nice big footprint. It's possible to work North America with that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And the exciting thing about FO29 is that if you've got a 2 meter beam up and a 70 SEMS beam on, then you can use those. You don't need any elevation because the most exciting DX you're going to work with is when it's close to the horizon anyway. So don't worry about having to elevate them. And a good friend of mine, Graham, G4VXE, who lives up in Cheltenham, I think he's worked about 30 states or so in the US through FO29, just with his regular terrestrial beams. Slightly bizarrely, although I've been sort of cautioning you about vertical antennas, a vertical will work quite well if it's got a nice low angle. And I have a V2000 6 meter, 2 meter, 70 SEMS white stick antenna at home, and I can quite happily use FO29 when it's close to the horizon. I use a duplexer to allow me to receive and transmit at the same time. So that's nice. If you want a low tech alternative, you can operate half duplex with an FT817. Obviously, the difficulty there is you can't listen when you're transmitting and work out where you're coming out. So what you have to do is, for the period of the pass, I end up using PCSat32 to work out if I transmit on 145.950 at this time during the pass, I will come out on this frequency, and that will sort of gradually move down throughout the pass. And I've done that and worked across the Atlantic with an FT817 and that antenna. So that was really nice to do. It's quite a nice holiday operating mode. I was saying to Jonathan earlier, one of the things I like about satellite operating is that no matter how rubbish your QSO is, let's try that again. No matter how rubbish your QTH is, your location is, as long as you can see a bit of sky, then you can work some satellites. It's quite nice. Obviously, it's better if you've got a low horizon, but it's a nice holiday operating mode. And you know, I spend some time in West Wales, and IO71 seems to be quite rare on the satellites, and it's quite fun working across the Atlantic and so on. If you've got two FT817s, then you can transmit and receive at the same time. We call that the FT1634. And what some canny people have done on is that some of you may remember that the FT817 they had some problems with the first models where the PA transistor would go. So you occasionally see those going on eBay for not very much money. Well, as far as you're concerned, all you want from one of the FT817s is a receiver. So pick one of those up, and that's quite a cheap way to have a second receiver. So yeah, FO29, lots of fun. There's some really nice videos on YouTube from these guys. Kg5CCI, Dave, he's worked some absolutely amazing stuff from a mountain outside Little Rock in Arkansas, including contacts where, as far as he's concerned, the satellite is below the horizon, which feels like it oughtn't to be possible. But if you're that high up and looking out across the sea, then it may be possible. So yeah, have a look at some of those videos, because they do show it very nicely and make it nice and simple. So that's Dave Kg5CCI's takeoff. I'm not sure how high the mountain is, but you can see it's not a bad takeoff, and it's probably a bit warmer up there than the Ridgeway in January, I think it's fair to say. So yes, Dave uses a blue box for his station, not like Patrick's wheelie bin. And then that was the other end of the 7,000 K QSO. I got the FT847 out so that I could operate full duplex and this antenna, and just drove out to the edge of the village where I had a reasonably low horizon, and worked into Arkansas, which was quite nice on 10 watts on VHF, really. Okay, so a few other satellites I haven't mentioned. I don't know if any of you have ever been listening to GB3WH or GB3RD and you've occasionally heard in the background and that will be the Chinese Xw2 satellites. Again, these were launched and they weren't all in the IARU satellite subband. So that's a little bit of a shame, but they're 2 meters down. Again, they're linear transponders, so sideband and CW. 2 meters down, 70 sems up. They are very sensitive. You'll probably find that if you've got a duplexer and you can operate full duplex or 2 separate transmitter on 70 sems and a receiver on 2 meters, you can listen at the same time. Then with 10 watts of CW, you'll hear your signal coming back, even on a vertical. So that can be quite fun. And I have got a simple signal back with phone as well. But it's quite fun actually trying to decode them as they. I'll be listening to one of the repeaters in the car and you'll just suddenly hear somebody start to call CQ on CW and you think, oh yeah, I know what's happening. So yeah, those are nice satellites to use. Some other satellites which I haven't mentioned, AO73, which was put together by AMSAT UK. There's a whole bunch of those which use a similar design. That's 70 sems up and 2 meters down, again linear transponders. This time of year it's a bit difficult to use AO73 apart from at the weekends. The reason for that is that when it's daylight where you are, it's just in beacon mode, and only when it goes into dark does the amateur transponder come on. So when we don't have very much night time at this time of year, it's a bit more tricky to use. AO7 is a really nice story. It was launched back in the 70s, I think, mid 70s, and it's in a nice high orbit. It has very, very good coverage. You can easily work into the middle of the States and the West Coast from Europe. Well, that was all great, and AO7 went up in, let's say, the mid 70s. And then a few years later, the batteries died, and we didn't hear AO7 for a very long time. And then something rather wonderful happened, that the batteries went open circuit on the satellite, so that when the satellite is in full sunlight, the solar panels are enough to power it, and you can hear it. So it really is quite QRP. If you run too much power at the receiver, you'll start to hear it warble, so please don't do that. And if you really run too much power, it will flick out of mode J, which is 70 sems up and 2 meters down, into mode A, which is 2 meters up and 10 meters down. So that's really unpopular, as you can imagine. But it's a lovely satellite, and it is really viable to use with a couple of FT817s and an antenna like that, and has some really nice coverage. And I think it's really nice to think of it just being powered by the sun. There's a few more satellites going up soon, mostly from AMSAT North America, including one that's going to come down on 10 gigs, I think, and it's going to be geostationary. And you think, actually, well, you know, how on earth could I receive something on 10 gigs? But actually, it's dead simple. It's probably a project for another evening. But what you can do is you can use. I did notice a Sky Dish out there. Actually, you could use one of those and an LNB, and then what you do is take the output of your LNB into something very simple, like a RTL SDR dongle, and tune around 600 megs, and that will give you a very nice 10 gigs receiver. Just keep the dish pointing at the satellite, and you're done.
So it's going to be geostationary?
Yeah. Actually, I implied that was an AMSAT North America launch. I think it's actually from a Middle Eastern group, but I can't remember the exact details. But I think it's something like 13 sems up, which will probably be more challenging for most of us, and 10 gigs down. But actually just receiving it it would be quite a nice project, I think. So I hope this has been interesting to you. If you want to find out some more, AMSAT UK are a really good organisation to support. They put money into the satellites that go up. You get Oscar News. You're involved in it, Tony, are you? Oh, no, somebody else. Sorry. Yes, I don't want to imply. But yeah, it's really nice organisation. There's lots of people who are active on satellites on Twitter, and that's what I find quite inspiring. You know, I'll see that, you know, somebody's done something and I think, oh, I could go and try that, and that's rather fun to do. And there is a VHF column in some magazine that I saw lying around that we try and cover I seem to get a lot of satellite news to the extent that sometimes it's embarrassing, and I think I've got slightly too much, but it's really nice that people write in with what they're doing on satellites, so lots of information there. So I think that was pretty much all I wanted to say. I'm glad we managed to at least hear SO50 and bounce a signal through ISS. That's the first time I've tried to do a live demo in one of these talks, so thank you for bearing with me. If you've got any questions, I will be very pleased to try and answer them, apart from about the antenna.
Has anybody ever worked through satellites at all? Yeah. What did you do? What did you use?
I'll just comment on that. 1970s, FT220, which, if you remember the FT220, is not very stable on SSB. The biggest thrill I had was listening to myself coming back on my FT101.
Oh, brilliant.
So up on 2 and back on 10.
I liked those Mode A satellites, they were really good.
Yeah, and you really noticed the Doppler as well. The tune.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's quite funny actually. Once if you operate a lot of satellites, you actually have one hand on the VFO and you're just tweaking it all the time while you're transmitting to sort of keep the frequency the same, particularly if you're operating on CW. And it's quite strange then when you go and work somebody on terrestrial, you know, on 6 meters ease or something, you think, the signal's not moving, what's going on?
He works on our accent. I did something exactly like Tim said in Swaziland when we had the expedition, and we got asked by South Africa to send satellite messages. Can you work something like that?
Yeah.
We did exactly that. We had 2 handhelds, 2 meter antenna, 70 cent antenna, because it was 4 of us, so we just let them. But it was a struggle. It was a struggle to keep it tracked, particularly polarization.
Yes.
Because there were low passes, but it saved. There was up the ship. But it worked, and we got 1 or 2.
And I bet they were pleased to work
They
you
were
as
happy,
yeah.
It was very nice, wasn't it?
Yeah, very,
But
very.
isn't the normal
The report is just the first floor of your locator square, isn't it?
I must admit, I tend to just give the first 4. I think some people like the, you know, the full locator, but I think the first 4 is absolutely fine. Yeah, you probably gather QSOs are should be short and snappy. You know, occasionally if I've been on Esso50 at 11 o'clock at night and there's only been one person on, I've had quite a rag chew, and that's quite fun to do, but just be conscious of who's around. Good. Yeah, do. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for listening.